The T-800 Model 101 was, and remains, one of the most memorable cyborgs, nay villains, in pop culture. Now, fresh on the back of my first part, looking back at the origins of the production, the special effect techniques, and impact of those first two, and only movies in my opinion, the second part dives into the games of the time across 8 and 16-bit consoles and computers, arcade and handhelds. Now check part 1 out to learn more about the creators, actors, pioneering effects, and inspiration for the story and iconic killer. Now sadly, movies to games never had great success or reputation in the 80s and 90s, and luckily UK retro developers Bitmap Bureau hold T2 in the same high regard as many of us, and have decided to create a nostalgic passion and technical memoir to those early 90s days, late last year. However, this celluloid to binary translation didn't always look such a surefire hit back in the day.
Hasta la vista, baby.
Hard to believe looking back at the film and forward to the new game, but it took an age for any games to appear. Even when the Terminator came out in 1984, well 85 in the UK, I always expected a game not to be far behind. A better movie to game candidate seemed hard to find. I mean, The Empire struck back only 2 years after the movie in 82, Indy raided the Ark, closely followed by E.T. Phoning Home, all three in the same year on the VCS. War games commenced on the ColecoVision in 84, The Last V8, aka Mad Max, in 85 on the C64, Friday the 13th in 86, Robocop took just a year in 88 to hit arcades, 8 and 16-bit computers. Even Batman the Movie, the previous monster blockbuster before T2, landed on C64, Amiga, ST and more within months of the film's 89 release. Now although Ocean were a huge reason for that, it still sets a precedent that didn't follow with the Terminator. In fact, the Terminator remained suspicious by its absence until T2 released in 1991. Then it was like buses, a flurry of T2 and the original Terminator games across the first half of the 90s in a future past barrage fitting of the plot. First-ish was Bethesda's 1991 The Terminator. Coinciding with T2's release, it shared similarities with Robocop 3 game from did and Ocean, which was in parallel development. Both used 3D worlds, open-ended design, a variety of things to do, and were early open-world games. It was a DOS game on PC, and it predominantly launched in the US. In fact, I never saw this game until many years later in the UK. I'm not even sure it ever had an official UK release, but if you do know, leave it in the comments below. Interestingly, you could play as either Kyle Reese saving Sarah or the Terminator to terminate Sarah across a fairly detailed downtown LA. It was impressive for the time and came about via the Hemdale IP ownership of the series being in transition. As is often true, these are broken down into various commodity-based commercial chunks, and game rights, movie rights, even story, actors, toys, etc. can be owned by different companies or individuals. See the modern day equivalent in Spider-Man and Sony. On the Cyberdyne scale, I score it a T400 for sound and a T600 for graphics and gameplay. Overall, an impressive time capsule for where 3D games were at the time, enjoyable and forward-looking, if a little beyond the PC CPUs and memory of the time, leaving it slow and clunky even on a then top-end 486. It was an RPG action game, buying gear, gathering money, weapons, even police, healing, shooting ranges, hospitals, with definite signs of the Elder Scrolls yet to come. But the navigation, combat, driving and game hook tire quickly, and it becomes repetitive, artistically far too bright and colourful, feeling nothing like the movie at all, and the animated sections seem to come from a different game compared to the vibrant colours of the 3D world. Me thinks this was a swapped IP game last minute mid-development to hit the T2 hype timeline. Robocop 3 was the better game due to more confined scope and scale within the current hardware limits, a decent start to the Terminator gaming legacy, but not the future it deserved just yet.
I'll be back.
Now, during this same time, Terminator Siege period, developing duo Richard Costello and the late Kevin Bulmer, another UK studio based in Wolverhampton known as Dementia, were commissioned by movie licensing professionals Ocean, who published this T2 game exclusively in Europe via an LGN subcontract deal.
It's all your fault! I'm not gonna let you do it.
Coinciding with the film's UK theatrical release of August 1991 on the still popular 8-bit computers in the Spectrum first, then the C64 and Amstrad, then slightly later in November on the 16-bit Atari ST and Amiga. Based on the team's prior success of quality ports, which started on 8-bit computers and the Atari ST with their 1986 Gauntlet port, a monstrously successful game at the time in the UK, and one I used to play with friends and strangers after school in the arcades and then at home. It was followed by the popular sequel Gauntlet 2, then Golden Axe, and a cracking first-person shooter cum RPG puzzler in 1990's Corporation, again on 16-bit home computers first. A game some 4 years ahead of System Shock, 3 years before Doom was a twinkle in id Tech's hard drive, and 2 before Wolfenstein 3D. It started 2 genres before anyone else, and sported real-time lighting, but some god-awful controls and terrible frame rates. With such a varied and successful portfolio, they were favourites for the game. Kevin was the artist handling all graphics and animation, while Richard wrote the whole game in assembler on a Mega 4 ST using the hugely popular dev pack, at least back then. It was following the ocean trend of each level being a genre, opening with a mall fight between the T-800 and T-1000, mimicking the Street Fighter 2 craze of the time, with Arnie doing a John Travolta, packing over 20 moves in this brawl. Later levels deploy a top-down Spy Hunter style chase in the sewers, a scrolling shoot down Skynet lane, and even a sliding puzzle section to fix Arnie's wrist or straighten his face, in the mould of those wooden sliding puzzles popular in the 80s, early 90s. Sadly, although graphically superior to the dire Mega Drive and Super Nintendo game discussed later, with excellent sprites, animation and colour, other aspects such as backdrops, performance, and certainly gameplay, variety, fun and longevity remained subpar. The drive-in sections were too long and lacked anything other than avoiding obstacles until the time ran down. The scrolling shooter section is boring, as are the multiple face-offs with the liquid baddie. It was a classic ST port to Amiga, with both 16-bit computers looking and sounding identical. As you can hear, it sounds and looks nigh on identical on both. Sound samples are a little bit better and clearer with more channels on the Amiga, but to the average player they're practically the same. Graphically also true, aside slightly more colours and minor visual and performance increases, such as 50 FPS versus 25 on those overhead driving sections, parallax scrolling added, and slightly better performance in the other sections. The Amiga could have delivered far more than what we got at the time, with interleave sprite updates during those Terminator fights, but the game did not use the Amiga's blitter, copper, playfields or DMA much at all, with colour being richer but not by much. Both 16-bit versions also suffer from level cuts from the far superior C64 8-bit computer version, which offered most of the game's quality and actually has more levels, which ironically was cut even heavier on the Spectrum. The cut Sarah Connor escape from the hospital mission and the T-800 Cyberdyne destruction are present here, both dropped from the 16-bit versions likely due to time. It was present in previews of the time in the magazines, but the other 8-bit team kept these missions in, adding more to the older computer version which are better for it, with Amiga and ST owners getting better sound, colours and digitised sections for all those extra bits. It manages to achieve a T800 on visuals but a rubber skinned T600 for everything else, and was a classic visuals first 16-bit game that underneath the organic external tissue was the same machine beating within, leaving a lacklustre, generic, repetitive and a pretty short game, less than 10 minutes if you rush straight through it. And all of us were still hungry for quality Terminator pixel action at home, but we did have other ways to play the game back then.
destroy everything.
The arcade's got a game better suited to the format. Terminator 2, the arcade game, went straight for the Ron Steele naming convention and also released within the 1991 timeline, at least in the arcades, October to be precise. It took the Operation Wolf Cabinet dual gun approach as you attacked Skynet's base, destroying T-800s, hunter-killers at every turn while shooting carefully placed boxes for ammo, boost and special weapons. Midway delivered on the visuals using the in-season digitised sprites, including Andrew Furlong and Robert Patrick, using their Y-Unit hardware and own digitisation techniques which powered Narc earlier and Mortal Kombat later. It landed on home machines, handhelds and even used the Sega Menacer and Super Nintendo scope light guns to bring the arcade home between 92 and early 94. Simple but effective use of an en vogue movie with a fun game style, it was a popular arcade at the time due to the ease of entry, frantic action and popular license. A T-800 level all round, with the arcade being the best, closely followed by Mega Drive or Super Nintendo with scope, although the colour palette swap needed once you turned on the scope is quite galling on those eyeballs. The Amiga versions were also quite good and worked much better with a mouse than a joystick, bridging the gap between scope and thumb pad quite nicely. It came out so late in 1993 though that the Atari ST had died off so much that only the Amiga was worth the investment in the 16-bit computer space, but consoles were taken over from computers in the gaming space, and the 16-bit Super Nintendo and certainly Mega Drive were battling it out with high quality arcade ports and Menacer or Super Scope options. Now unlike the Amiga, which ran at a variable 25Hz here in the UK or 30 in NTSC markets, the consoles double that to 50 or 60Hz, but only the Super Nintendo uses most of the digitised sprites from the arcade, with the Mega Drive using a hand-painted sprite design which helps the look of it, but it's much brighter than all the other versions, well, aside the SNES Super Scope mode, and this leaves the Amiga version, visually, somewhere in between, albeit with half the performance, and all suffer from brain-melting music and weak sound effects, with the Amiga not splitting music and effects to 2 channels each, meaning if you have music and FX enabled, you just get gunshot and music only, and rarely some screams, and the Amiga losing out on sound to the Mega Drive, well that's sacrilege, come on. Finally, the 8-bit consoles were hanging on and the handheld market was still going strong, with Master System and Game Gear offering nigh on identical versions, albeit zoomed in on the Game Gear with a richer colour palette offering a slightly better image quality. But the Master System did not even offer a scope choice of play, instead locked to controller only. And as such, they are heavily cut back with tiny sprites, barren looking levels and poor sound and controls, though it still uses parallax scrolling on both. Whilst also struggling though to run at 20 FPS, which makes it feel very clunky on the D-pad of both machines. Finally, the Game Boy also had a custom version that looked and played similar but was worse looking, with different level icons and even combat elements, making it an oddity for the tiny green screen king. And although it remained at 50Hz, unlike the Master System and Game Gear versions, all three are forgettable, with most of the charm on these games lost without the gun. The arcade was also the hardest due to its massive sprite abilities swamping the screen, which the SNES, Mega Drive and certainly Amiga simply could not compete with.
Destroy everything.
This deal, secured with Bethesda, also provided other games. Terminator 2 Judgment Day from UK studio Bit Software was one such release, possible as Bethesda subcontracted the license out to them. Landing on the Game Boy in '91, this kicked off a UK-based port and development hive, with this Game Boy version being ported, sort of, to other 8-bit machines, but not in 1991, so covered later, mostly because they're not the same game. The Game Boy version is a good mix of run and gun action and platforming, with puzzles such as rewiring the T-800 infiltrator unit after level 2 before you send it back to protect John. An increasingly complex pathway reroute like Maze Game breaks up the action well, but was already a staple by now since Ocean and others introduced it in the late 80s. But damn, these are hard. Not due to the complexity, more so the time limit and tiny screen. My old eyeballs struggled with the final puzzle, I can tell you. Now the game runs very well on the Nintendo OG Game Boy, detailed sprite, smooth 60 FPS, a fake sprite based parallax effect on level 4 is a nice touch, good sound and music, although this is not the film's soundtrack or even memorable, but you can at least turn it on or off. Off is my preferred choice. The gameplay and time travel does seem to be an inspiration for the Terminator games released later on Sega consoles by Probe, and although not long or large levels, mixing up driving, shooting, puzzles, for handheld action it scores a hyper-alloy-tastic T800 in all areas, and it was the best entry so far for terminated pixel action, albeit pretty short and could do with more levels, although it was a decent Game Boy game that closed out 1991 and the first year of Terminator gaming. And that wraps up the first year of Terminator gaming action. All done. 1991 was a big year for the franchise, one of the best sequels ever made, a remake with a twist on the original, but it rode the wave of the then emerging push on branded merchandise of movies into games and how mixed the results were across all hardware platforms, and it tells a story not too dissimilar from today. But come back for the following years of 8 and 16-bit Cyberdyne action soon when 1992 and beyond saw even more atrocities befall our eyes, ears and fingers. But if you enjoyed this retro-fueled Terminator nostalgic trip, or indeed anything else I've created, written, you can watch more on my channel, read more over on my website, and most importantly, help me make more by subscribing, liking and commenting down below. And for early access to videos like this, exclusive access to others and Q&A, you can support me over on Patreon for a few dollars or pounds a month, and it really helps drive my content and support me. Many names and supporters have helped me, and videos like this are only possible due to that support. I thank you for watching, and remember, I'll be back.
Are you John Connor? Well done.